Steve, this one's for you. The gift of troubled waters. As Pastor Jason identified last Sunday in his sermon, we are using the book Out of Solitude for the 30-minute devotional time during church council. And Pastor John's study guide for that book includes this question. What are some important things you would like to accomplish in your life before you die? Kind of big question. What's on your bucket list? Important things on your bucket list. But we're going to do something a little different in this sermon. There'll be a few places in the sermon where you get to respond to some questions. Probably just one person to a question, and only one or two sentences. What do you want to see happen or accomplished in your life before you die? Anyone want to tackle it? Go. No. You've got a long way to go yet. I'm calling in if nobody else does. Yeah, go for it.
Peace in the world.
Okay, she wants peace in the world. I think that's a pretty good thing to want. I know exactly what I want to see happen in my life. It is not something like peace in the world that I can necessarily accomplish, but I do want to be a part of it. I want to be a part of God's great renewal or revival or awakening, whatever you might call it, in the church today. That's not a small thing, but that is what I hunger for and long for and want to be a part of. God's awakening in His church worldwide today. Don't you want that also? The 12 disciples were a part of God's new awakening that was happening during that time. That new awakening would spread throughout their entire known world. The old ways were being challenged. The old understandings of life were being replaced. The way things had always been, the way they had always worshipped, now was being kind of fulfilled and replaced. This new awakening that was happening was all centered in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The 12 disciples were handpicked by Him, handpicked to be His sort of advance guard, so to speak, of this new thing that God was doing. Centered in Jesus, taught by Jesus, molded and shaped by Jesus, sent out by Jesus. Jesus spoke to the crowds in stories, in parables. But this advanced guard, this advanced team of 12 disciples had the privilege of having everything explained to them personally, as a group, sometimes individually, privately. What was it like for those 12 to be in the presence of this master teacher? There have been a couple of times in my life when I have been in the audience listening to people speak, people who I felt had lived the faith in the presence of very, very, very difficult situations. One was a man named E. Stanley Jones. He was one of the greatest missionaries of the 20th century, a missionary to India. I heard him speak. One was Corrie ten Boom. With Corrie and her entire family helped to save Jews during World War II. And she and her family were sent to the concentration camps. And there she watched her entire family die in those camps. I heard her speak. And one was Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who walked beside her husband and awakened the entire nation to know the injustice of segregation. I heard her speak. And when I was in the presence of those people, even in the audience, listening to those people, it felt like to me as if I was in the presence of the holy. The presence of the holy. People who had lived the faith in the face of difficult situations. What was it like for the disciples to be in the presence of Jesus day after day, kind of at night rolling out their sleeping mat right next to the teacher, and then in the morning waking up and he's still there, and they get to eat breakfast with him over a campfire perhaps, or maybe traveling with him and going with him to a luxurious home of a tax collector. It must have felt just overwhelming to them. A sense of awe, devotion, mystery, holiness. In some ways or another, it kind of must have rubbed off even on them a little. Here they were in the presence of Jesus all the time. They were the ones that he had chosen. They were the ones that were able to spend all that individual time with him. They were the precious, the special people. What's it like for you? What is it like for you to be in the presence of Jesus? One or two sentences. Someone? What's it like for you to be in the presence of Jesus? Yes?
It makes me cry.
Okay? It makes her cry. Being in his presence is a powerful thing. It was late in the afternoon, early evening, when Jesus dismissed the large crowds. He'd been teaching these crowds all day long, teaching them what are now, kind of famous parables that we know. And he just told the disciples to get into the boat and go to the other side of the sea, to this country of the Gentiles, to the territory of their enemies. I wonder what they thought now. What did they feel? Did they simply say, "Sure, Jesus, let's go"? Or in their minds, at least, did they wonder, why are we going out to sea in the evening when that's the time of storms? I wonder if they began to question in their minds, why do we have to go across the sea anyway? That's foreign territory. Why do we have to go? Well, they went, they obeyed, and they took sleepy-eyed, exhausted Jesus with them. The disciples had to learn. They had to learn that as participants in God's new thing, this new awakening that was happening, they would be called to do things and go places that they'd never dreamt of. They would be called to get out of the box, so to speak. What about for you? How has God called you, in one or two sentences, at some time in your life, to get out of the box? To do something you had never thought you would ever do? Anyone? Yeah.
To go to Mississippi
To go to Mississippi after Katrina. Something you had never thought of ever doing. Out of the box. The disciples did what Jesus told them. They got in the boat. They were heading across the sea. They were out of the box. They were in the deep. And then it happened. Then in the middle of their storm, in the middle of their journey, a fierce storm arose. Wind and waves, and the boat was beginning to fill with water. Well, have you ever done that which is right? That which you thought was the leading of God? And you ended up with more trouble than you'd ever had before? I have. Well, for the disciples, the story does not say that the disciples were afraid. In the story itself, there's no indication to say that they were specifically afraid. Many of them were fishermen, and they had been out in the sea before. They had faced many, many storms before. They knew what to do. Maybe on the inside, they were petrified. But I think, and this is a meism, this is what I think. I think on the outside, those 12 men were not willing to show each other or Jesus that they were afraid. They were macho. And macho men don't show that they're afraid. No way. But from the story, we do learn that these disciples were confused. They were questioning. Why would Jesus still be asleep when they were in such a critical, desperate situation? Maybe even they were full of blame and accusation. He's the one who put him out there in the first place.
Right.
Jesus was fast asleep. Don't you care? Don't you care? Well, they were in a life-threatening situation. Maybe this whole new awakening that was beginning to happen would end up in the bottom of the drink and nothing would show for it. Jesus, don't you care?
Yeah.
They cried. They screamed over the howling of the wind and into the ear of the hard-sleeping Jesus. Jesus woke. Right there in the midst of a fierce storm. He was the epitome of restful sleep. A non-anxious presence, if you will. This is what I picture him doing. I picture him waking up, rubbing his eyes, yawning a bit, looking around, and then calmly, strongly, forcefully, authoritatively, he said, "Wind, shut up!" That's the literal translation.
Yeah.
"Wind, shut up!" And what happened? There was dead calm. Dead calm. Now, after speaking to the wind and the sea, Jesus began to look at his disciples right in the eye. And I have a feeling that when he looked at them in the eye, they began to squirm just a bit. And he said, "Why are you afraid? Why are you afraid?" Jesus sees our hearts. Even though the disciples, at least in my understanding, could not, would not express their fear, Jesus identifies it right away. Jesus called a spade a spade. Why are you afraid? Fear and faith are not synonymous. Now, this word fear in the Greek there's many, many different words for fear. This particular word means cowardice. Why are you a coward? Why are you cowardly? I guess the word is. Have you ever found sometimes that other people can read you better than you can read yourself? And in this case, Jesus saw their hearts. But at this point in the story, something happens. Something dramatically changes all of a sudden in the story. Now there's no more storm. There's no more questions by the disciples to Jesus. There's no more pretending not to be afraid. There's no more questions of Jesus. There's only one little statement. It is, and they were filled with great awe. They were filled with great awe. Now, unfortunately, the English doesn't do an adequate translation of that word, I don't think. There's a couple Greek words here meaning the same thing. The writer puts both of them together, kind of emphasizing the point. They were petrified. They were fearful. But this fear is not cowardice. This fear is a fear of reverent fear, of reverence. We call it awe, for lack of a better word. They were terrified, but they were terrified in the sense of tremendous, reverent fear. Now they were in the presence. They were in the presence of one who controlled the wind and the sea. Jesus was not simply a good teacher. He was not a teddy bear sort of guy. He wasn't even a new revolutionary. He was not kind of a buddy-buddy God. He was the God and the controller of wind and sea. And as such, he was to be treated reverently. Reverent fear. Even though we don't use that word very often in relationship to God. That's the word used here. So, as part of God's new awakening today in His church, we are first encountered or met by this God of ours, who is truly something other than us, who is truly holy. And yet, at the same time, we find that this God who is other, separate, different than we are, actually lives within us. In this new awakening of God, the awakening of His people, we find that God wants us to believe and to behave and to belong differently than we have ever done before. It's a new time. And then, in this new awakening of God, we at times find out that we're right in the middle of disaster. We're in the middle of storms. We're in the middle of problems. And it seems at times as if God is nowhere to be found. But as we continue in this new awakening of God, new awakening of the people of God, we find that this God of ours is right next to us, right within us. And He knows everything about us. He knows us intimately. And finally, in this kind of new and great awakening of the people of God, we discover that God is bigger than we could ever imagine. That God is there. Well, I want to be a part of the awakening of God's people to that kind of a God and God's work within God's people. Don't you?